Forza Horizon 6 is launching on May 19th, not for PlayStation. It is promised, but that's a bit of a delay, but PC and Xbox. And we now have the PC system requirements to take a look at. And I thought it'd be interesting to compare them to the previous game, because when I first looked at that, I was like, wait a second, did they actually not raise the minimum system requirements? And you could even interpret them as having been lowered, or at least in a similar class. And yeah, I think that's how I would interpret this. More on that in a second. But first, let's also look at some additional information we have, because there's some other good news. For example, all of the major upscaling brands do seem to be supported here. Here, I'll make myself tiny and out of the way. I'm tiny. Okay, so NVIDIA DLSS 4, it's not 4.5, but that means the driver level override should be able to get you 4.5 if you prefer it in this game. AMD FSR 4 or 3, depending on GPU compatibility, and Intel XeSS 2.1. They've also promised improvements to ray tracing over previous games, although it looks like you can also just turn ray tracing off if you don't want to use that for performance reasons. So ray-traced reflections will reflect both cars and the environment. That's not always the case. And ray-traced global illumination will also be available for those who want to use it. Also, a huge upgrade over the last game. In the previous game, I hated benchmarking it because if you change any graphic settings, like there's a really lengthy restart process to even check what the visual change looks like. And it looks like now you can change the graphic settings without needing to restart the game, and there is a live preview of what those graphics changes look like. This is fantastic. I mean, for benchmarking purposes, I'll still restart the game for best practice, but this is going to be a really good option for people trying to tweak the graphic settings and optimize them as they're playing it. Looks like you can real-time monitor video and system memory usage while playing, and there will still be a built-in benchmark tool, so this will probably be a good one to include in upcoming graphics card reviews, etc. They're also promising Steam Deck support, as well as Xbox ROG Ally support, and cross-saves available across every platform, including, if you have the Xbox and Windows version, and I guess even jumping over to PlayStation 5 version as well. So that all sounds great as far as the PC feature support. They also talk about, ultra-wide support and unlocked frame rates, etc. So sounds like they're doing a lot for the PC version of the game. But let's jump into how I was saying that, at least on the minimum side of things, I don't think they're actually saying you need more than you used to. Now, the new system requirement chart for Forza Horizon 6 is certainly improved because they're telling us a graphics preset, resolution, and target frame rate, whereas the old one didn't. However, the min spec on the old one was like a GTX 970 or RX 470, which were both 4GB graphics cards. And now we're looking at cards like the GTX 1650, which is a 4GB graphics card, and actually isn't necessarily more powerful than a GTX 970. More on that in a second. They also list the Intel Arc A380 and the RX 6500 XT for the AMD version. Now, the system RAM, they're now listing at 16 rather than 8 previously. Some games don't actually need 16, but that's one place where it does look like it stepped up. And actually, the CPU does look to be a step up here as well, going from the Ryzen 3 1200 up to the Ryzen 5 1600. Still from that same first, 1000 series, of Ryzens, though, but it's jumping from the Ryzen 3 to the Ryzen 5, so more of the mid-range part. And then the Intel CPU jumping from an i5 4460 up to i5 8400. So on the CPU and system memory side of things do look to be stepped up, and they're now also calling out an SSD instead of just a hard disk drive. But on the GPU side of things, if we pop over to the relative performance chart, the GTX 1650, which is now listed as your 1080p low settings 60 FPS card, I was comparing that to the 970 on Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart. Now, granted that this isn't perfect, and the older GPUs get, I think the less aligned they can be to how things currently perform. I just messed with my camera there. Anyway, the GTX 970 is generally listed as a little bit more powerful than the GTX 1650. That's pretty interesting. And the RX 470, which was also listed as a minimum for the previous game, is pretty much right in line with the 1650. Cards like the Arc A380, also right in line here, and that's one of the current minimum spec ones. Now, the most powerful listed for the current min spec is the RX 6500 XT for AMD, which is about 33% more powerful on average than the 1650, at least according to this relative performance chart, which again is ballpark figures and can vary from game to game. So I thought that's pretty interesting that they seem to be wanting people who could play the previous game to still be able to play this version, at least on the GPU side of things. If this was another question I had, now they're telling us that this is for 60 FPS at 1080p low. Maybe this older version was targeting like 30 FPS. Now, I don't have a 970 to pop in and test it out, but I did Google search that, and I found this video here from Xcape on YouTube benchmarking 1080p low settings, and he did show the graphic settings here, so 1080p. And graphics settings set to the low preset, and then driving around a bit. Now, it's not the built-in benchmark, but you can see frame rate numbers are generally staying over 60 FPS. So it does look like at least good chunks of the previous game could run at 60 FPS at low settings on the minimum spec GPU that they listed. This is also on a pretty low-end CPU, actually I think a little bit below the previous game's min-spec CPU. So maybe it dips in places, but it does really actually seem to line up. Unless, of course, they're not really targeting a native 1080p here. So that was kind of my next question, but I actually scrolled further along here, and if you go all the way over to the right for the extreme ray traced settings, they actually mention resolution 4K upscaled, whereas the rest of these just say resolution and then don't say upscaled. So with that in mind, it does seem like that they are distinguishing between upscaled and not in this system requirements chart. And so this does appear to be still targeting a native 1080p low at 60 FPS. Now, we don't know what low settings look like now. And they're, like I said, CPU, system RAM, and SSD are now steps up compared to the previous game, but I thought that was at least interesting. Now, the previous game's recommended spec was an RX 590 or a GTX 1070. In the current game, it is stepping up a bit here. So we're going up to an RTX 3060 Ti or 6700 XT or Intel Arc A, not B, but A 580. Staying at the 16 gigabytes of system memory and still with an SSD here. They're also stepping up the CPUs, which is not always needed, but some settings do affect the CPU side, so that is something to keep an eye on. We're jumping up to a much more modern platform at kind of mid-range parts, although these are still a number of years old now at this point, 4 or 5 years or so, I think, off the top of my head. So that is also jumping up. So recommended, they're now targeting high settings, so going up from low settings to high settings, as well as increased resolution from 1080p to 1440p, and still targeting around 60 plus FPS. And notice they're saying 60 plus rather than 60. So the minimum was probably like maybe averages 60, but definitely dips below. And this one's now more probably like minimum 60 and oftentimes above in less demanding areas. That's how I would read that comparison there. And if we jump over to the tech power up relative performance chart, you'll notice that this is a huge jump. So it looks like going from low settings to high settings, as well as increasing that resolution, is going to be a big step up in the current game. So, and also remember the previous game was a much smaller jump to the recommended spec, but that could have been, not jumping up resolution as well, right? So the previous game recommended was like a GTX 1070. We'll probably spot that along the way. And again, if you don't have one of the GPUs listed, that's what this relative performance chart helps with, right? You can probably spot yours along the way as we scroll up. So again, we're scrolling past the 1650, which is the minimum, scrolling up to the previous game's recommended, which you'll spot here at the GTX 1070. But now we're going to have to keep scrolling up in order to hit the current game's recommended pretty considerably higher here, going with cards like the 3060 Ti and 6700 XT. So to jump from the minimum to the recommended is like a 3x performance increase. So there's a lot turning up when you go to those high graphic settings, it looks like. I'm going to go ahead and set the 3060 Ti as the baseline now. That's an 8 gigabyte graphics card, so they do seem to be indicating that high settings at 1440p native resolution should be okay on an 8 gigabyte graphics card. Of course, we can test that out when I actually get access to the game, but that is what they're saying. And notice that they've paired up reasonable pairings here with the 3060 Ti and 6700 XT as far as which GPUs they chose from AMD and NVIDIA. Now, what seems out of place to me here is the Intel Arc A580. I'm emphasizing the A because the B580 tends to be roughly in this performance tier, a little bit below the 3060 Ti and the 6700 XT, but reaching about 90% of the performance, so it would make sense to include in the same bracket in a systems requirements chart. What seems weird to me is the A580 is significantly less powerful than the B580. The A580 is only reaching 66% of the performance of the 3060 Ti, which it's paired with in the same tier in the relative performance, in the system requirements chart. Now, a system requirements chart isn't a benchmark chart, so it makes sense to have some variance, but that seems like a wide variance, so I actually wonder if they meant to say Intel Arc B580 and they accidentally said A580. That's just me wondering, because the B580 seems to be much closer to that performance tier. Now, if we scroll up to Extreme, there's not really a direct comparison. In the previous game, there's an ideal, and now we have both an extreme and an extreme ray trace setting. So now I'm feeling like we don't really have too much to directly compare to on the previous system requirements chart, so I'm just gonna switch over to, let's just look at the new system requirements chart in total. So now we've got extreme versus extreme RT. So extreme without the RT side is targeting 4K resolution at 60 plus FPS, and they do not mention upscaling, which again, upscaling is mentioned here, so to me that implies by its absence that they do not mean upscaling. And the graphics preset as extreme, but without RT. It's unclear if there's any ray tracing included in the extreme settings that aren't listed as RT, but in this one it specifically says ray tracing enabled. So I would read this as probably max settings without ray tracing, but you know, some games do include ray tracing in the non-RT named presets, so that's a bit of an unknown here at this point. Notice the CPUs do step up again a bit to more powerful 12th gen from Intel or a newer generation from AMD, so keep that in mind as well. Sometimes system requirements charts kind of nonsensically jump up the CPU side of things, though. It's not always actually required. The GPUs are jumping up to a 4070 Ti or RX 7900 XT from AMD, and the system RAM is also jumping up from 16 to 24. Again, it's unclear if that's actually necessary, and they're also specifying going from an SSD to an NVMe SSD. So would a SATA SSD be having trouble, streaming in all of the highest quality assets? Or is this just what they tested it on and maybe it is okay on a SATA SSD? It's really rare to find major gameplay differences between a SATA SSD and an NVMe SSD beyond load times. So it'd be interesting if this is a game where that actually did matter, though. Maybe it's worth testing out. Now, the GPU side of things we'll spend the most time looking at. So 3060 Ti to a 4070 Ti to jump from 1440p to 4K and from high settings to extreme settings. Now notice if you didn't jump to 4K and you stayed at 1440p, you'd probably be hitting much higher frame rates, right? So some people are like, they left out 1440p. Well, again, if you go beyond the 3060 Ti in performance and stick to, 1440p, you could then turn up graphic settings and or get higher frame rates depending on how much more powerful you get. But 4070 Ti, increasing graphic settings and resolution. The 3060 Ti, if we set that as the 100% baseline, the 4070 Ti is what we're looking for, right? Let me just double check. Yep, 4070 Ti. So let's scroll up. Again, you may spot your GPU along the way here. And 4070 Ti is considerably more powerful. 4070 Ti at about a 66% performance increase, and that is giving us that additional resolution and the additional graphics settings bump. I'm going to go ahead and set the 4070 Ti as the baseline now. That's a 12 gigabyte GPU, so it looks like 4K Extreme should be playable on 12 gigabytes according to their official system requirements charts. And notice that they paired up the 7900 XT with the 4070 Ti in this chart. Now, is that a reasonable thing to do? Yeah, they look like they're in a similar but not identical performance tier on average. So 7900 XT, generally about 11% faster when not using ray tracing, but an 11% performance difference is completely reasonable for pairing up two GPUs, especially because sometimes one game favors one brand over another compared to the average result. So Those seem like perfectly reasonable to pair up. And then if you kick on ray tracing, they're saying that you would want to jump to the 5070 Ti or the 9070 XT, as well as turn on upscaling if you're going to be staying at 4K there. So that, and they're also jumping system RAM up to 32 gigabytes. Now, I'd be honestly kind of surprised if 24 wasn't enough, but they are including that, but they're not adding in any additional CPU performance. So interesting. Now, let's take a look at this. So the 4070 Ti jumping up to a 5070 Ti isn't a massive jump. It's about 28% performance. 9070 XT, similar jump, generally slightly less powerful than the 5070 Ti. And depending on how heavy the ray tracing workload is, it's sometimes pretty significantly behind in like path tracing workloads, but sometimes actually fairly competitive in lighter ray tracing workloads, which is, it's unclear what to expect from this particular version. If the ray tracing was at all designed around like the PS5 Pro, I would expect it to be at a level that the 9070 XT handles pretty well, and probably wouldn't see a massive gap here. And they are listing them next to each other in the performance chart. That seems reasonable if it's a medium-ish ray tracing type workload. All right, so that's the jump here. They're reasonable to pair up. They're unclear exactly how much upscaling is being used here. Are we performance mode upscaling? Are we quality mode upscaling? So there's certainly some things to test out. But overall, this all looks like good stuff to me. It seems like they're offering a ton of scalability down to GPUs that could play the previous game. That they're probably good here, although those other pieces of the chart, like the CPU and system RAM and SSD requirement, could end up being a hang-up there. Love that they talk about Steam Deck support, so this should be pretty dang scalable. And I also like being able to scale further to the high end, including high-end features like ray tracing, but them not being mandatory for a good visual experience. Now, how are the visuals with and without the ray tracing? How does it actually perform? Does this end up being realistic? We'll find out when the game actually launches, again on May 19th. And this is definitely one I'm interested in benchmarking. The one thing that's annoying me here that I'll just kind of leave as, I don't like that, is similar to the previous game, because I do remember this being obnoxious then as well, is that if you want to get access to the game as early as possible, you have to pay for the more expensive premium edition. So you can get access to the game starting on May 15th if you pay for the premium edition, and if you don't, then you have to wait until the 19th. And I always find that really frustrating as both a player and a reviewer. I don't like that. Now, I think I see why they do that with Game Pass games. Because, there's that issue of, okay, are people just going to play this on Game Pass and then not actually pay for the full game? And we'd like people to pay for Game Pass and buy the full game. So I think they're trying to encourage the biggest fans of the game to pay for both by giving that incentive with the premium edition. I always get frustrated by that. I don't like locking out the early access period to people who pay a whole heck of a lot more for the game. I find that frustrating and a little bit of a malicious monetization practice. I guess it's not as bad as pay-to-win features, but anyway, that's my thought overall. Are you guys excited about this game? Let me know in the comment section. I'll link all the sources in the video description. Hope all of you have an excellent day.